Welcome to the East Midlands group of the Royal Meteorological Society. I'm the chairman of the local group in the East Midlands. The local centres, such as us, exist to bring the society to the various regions and conversely to bring the regional expertise to the society. Now, before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to have a couple of introductory slides. So if we move to this one, the software we're using is called Demio. And if you have problems with the Demio, it's recommended that you switch to Chrome as a browser, which apparently works better. If it works fine, don't worry. There's a control bar at the top, which allows you to change the size of the slides. And there's also a chat function, which you can use to ask questions at any point during the presentation. Catherine will then sort the questions, and I will ask them at the end of the talk. There's a monthly newsletter known as Met Matters, which is free, which is very important. It's a general interest newsletter produced by the Society, and you can sign up to this at the website as shown here. If you're a keen meteorologist, you can join the Society, which welcomes all kinds of interest in meteorology, both amateur and professional. That's not free, I'm afraid, but you can find the details at the Society website again. Right, if I move back to tonight's speaker. Tonight's speaker is Professor Georgina Endfield. She's a former colleague of mine from the University of Nottingham. We worked together for many years. And she's now at the University of Liverpool, where she's a professor of, sorry, check my notes here, environmental history and associate pro-vice chancellor for research and impact for the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. She works on environmental history and climate history and using historical records for the reconstruction of past climates. She's applied a variety of historical sources and approaches to doing this in many different parts of the world, including Southern Africa, Mexico, and the UK. And now I'd like to hand over to Georgina to talk about weather stories from the archives. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you very much indeed to yourself and Catherine, and to all of you for coming this evening. I'm sorry I can't see you all, but I'm very grateful to you for giving up the time on this slightly wintry but lovely late evening and early spring, as it were. So today I just want to give a few examples really of some of the work that I've been doing in conjunction with some important colleagues, some of whom were at Nottingham while I was there. So a lot of this work is stuff I've led on, but in conjunction with a team really that included Lucy Veal, Simon Naylor, Marie-Jeanne Royer, James Bowen and Neil MacDonald. But it's really a kind of a tour through some of the work that we've been doing in a UK context, looking at archives and documentary histories of extreme and unusual weather in a UK context, the stories that people have told, the way that they've written it, and the experiences that they've shared. So just as a bit of context, a lot of this material, though not all of it, relates to quite a recent project that I had, which was supported through the Arts and Humanities Research Council with a multi-institutional project, different universities involved, and a whole range of partners, really. And this has kept us rather busy. It was called Spaces of Experience, Horizons of Expectation, and it was very much a kind of history of extreme and unusual weather in a UK context over 400 or so years, using our rich archival collections across the country in order to explore stories of unusual and extreme weather. Now, the reason for doing this work is that extreme weather is with us. It's very newsworthy. It's been brought into relief over the past few decades as we've seen a bit of an increase in the number of extreme events and a higher frequency, higher intensity extreme weather associated with climate change. So it's never far from the news, really, and it's been brought into sharp focus, obviously, in recent months with the sequence of storms that we had at the start of the year and also late last year, and the damage that this caused. So it's very much in relief. If I just go back to a recent, well, in the last 10 years or so, recent examples of big storm events. So this is when weather extremes really come into focus and become a talking point. And it's often when I get requests to go and do a piece on the local radio about, is this unusual, is this unprecedented, you know? And what I really wanted to show with this sequence of images is that actually we tend to have quite short memories when it comes to extreme and unusual weather, and particularly in this case, storms. So you'll remember, many of you, the extreme storms that we had at the tail end of 2013 into 2014, when our work on this project really began. And the newsworthy stories, I suppose, focus on the damage to the line at Dawlish Warren, and the real cutting off of Cornwall, really, from the rest of the country as a result. And also the damage on Aberystwyth seafront, with some of our coastal heritage really taking and bearing the brunt of the extreme and unusual weather at that time. Big storms causing lots of damage. But here's two images from various different parts of the archives that we've been looking at, including the Illustrated London News, showing a breach on the line, South Devon coast, 1855. Not a very dissimilar picture, really. And there we have Aberystwyth seafront, 1927, both after key storm events. Now, the thing that interests me here is not that these things have happened before, what are we worried about, so much as what gets remembered, what gets forgotten, and something called the recency effect, the fact that in this particular sequence of images, the newer events have replaced the older events and replaced those kinds of events in people's memory. So what we're trying to do, and what we've been trying to do with this project, is explore the memories, go into the deeper archives, find previous examples and learn lessons from those examples. Think about the way in which people talked about them, recorded them, understood them, articulated why they were happening, and also thought about the way in which they might share their stories for future generations. So we've been working across a series of case studies in the UK that were recognised as being at risk of increasing frequency and intensity of extreme and unusual weather. Big broad areas, really, linked to the DEFRA climate change risk assessments. So our broad areas of concern are shown on the map here. And we wanted to explore archival records of unusual and extreme weather events in these areas using the local collections and local records offices, archival collections in museums and universities. I'll come on to that in a minute. And really to be able to see how different communities in different contexts have been affected by, might comprehend, respond to future events as both climate and communities change. So these are the areas in which we've been working. And the purpose of the project, the broader project, and it's kind of the tip of the iceberg that we've got to at the moment in terms of the work, has been fourfold, really. To use this case study-based approach to reconstruct some climate histories. And this is an important one because we haven't gone into the archives and the collections with fixed ideas or known events. We've gone in with a very open mind and seeing what the archives tell us. So that's a really key point, really. It's been very much about exploring the archives, pulling out the kinds of references, anecdotes, stories from the archives, piecing those together, and trying to sort of amalgamate those stories to try to work out what's going on in different places, revealing particular events in some cases, or looking at spatial impacts of known events as well. So those climate histories is something we've been working on. To investigate the impacts on the nature of human responses. These are historical documents that people have written. So the human fingerprint is inscribed into all of these documents inherently. So the way in which people talk about events leads us to be able to explore the impact on the social responses that those events engendered. And we've also been looking at different types of response, individual community responses, the way in which people have recorded things, the genre of recording and how that's changed over time, and the kinds of things, the kinds of weather that gets embedded, inscribed into social memory and cultural fabric of communities, and the adaptations that have been engendered as a result. Now, when we piece all of this together, we hope we're also going to be able to look at particular areas and track stories of resilience, trajectories of vulnerability, those kinds of areas that are more or less or frequently affected by particular types of events. It's not necessarily what I'll share today, but it's an opportunity that we'd like to explore. So I mentioned a minute ago that our approach has been very open with the archival collections. So we've been looking at a very wide variety of historical documents for the reconstruction of historical climate variability in order to pick out and tease out unusual and extreme. We've been looking across county archives, records offices, local archives, national archives, and there's just a few of those listed there, and identifying materials by looking through online catalogues where they exist, often it's only paper catalogues, and literally searching for particular key terms, including weather, storm, flood, frost, snow, wind, tempest, and different kinds of historic terminology as well. Now, luckily for us, weather is ubiquitous, and in a whole range of different types of material, it's mentioned a lot, right? So you can imagine, especially in the UK, people talk but also write about the weather a lot because of its familiarity, because of its everydayness. You know, it's normal, and so people talk about weather a lot, and from that we're able to elicit what was different, what was unusual, the way in which people talked about things. And we've recorded and transcribed from original unpublished documentation, different kinds of archival material, the way in which people recorded, the way in which the quotes basically from the archival materials. We've dated them and also georeferenced them so we can know what happened in what place. And this is important for looking at sort of spatial and temporal impacts. So just very briefly to run through the types of documents, and then I'll give you some examples. Well, I'll give you an insight into what we've done with this all, and then some examples of the analysis potential of what we've done. So we've been using both numerical and qualitative based materials. So this included things like in the top left-hand corner here, you've got a meteorological record from the Gardens at Chatsworth, which is a lovely piece of work that we had to work with there in terms of particular sort of numerical instrumental data. We used a lot of letters, correspondence written by all different kinds of people, actually, though there are some famous names in the work that we've done as well. D.H. Lawrence, Queen Victoria. So we've got some key figures, but it depended on what was held in the archives, really, and we've gone with that. Lots of diaries, including diaries like this one, which is from Peter Peg-Burnell in Winkburn. And he was a farmer and recorded the weather every single day in this sort of diary stroke almanac. He was great at comparing what the weather was doing and how this contrasted with what the almanac said it was likely to do. So lots of materials like that. Also, we've used secondary materials as well, so pamphlets, newspapers, mainly for sort of supporting evidence, because this is published material, and most of the work that we were interested in this project was about unpublished things that people hadn't seen or read. We've also got old photographic albums, images. This is actually the River Trent, with people skiing on the River Trent. This is from a photograph album from 1895, which was a sort of classic Victorian winter. So a really lovely photographic album there that we've used. Other examples might include things like this, souvenir records from great floods, in this case from the Derby floods of May 1932. And it wasn't unusual during flood events in the past to produce a souvenir record or a set of images included in newspapers, for example. We've also got some really lovely physicians' records. We're tapping into the association of weather and health, particularly through the 18th century. So this is John Huxham's meteorological observations in Plymouth. He was an English surgeon, a provincial doctor, notable for his study of fevers. And so his interest in weather was its association with the way in which it might lead to fevers among his constituents, his patients, you know. And so we've got his texts as well from the Royal Society, and been looking at the way in which people in the past associated weather and health, and particularly unusual weather and health impairment. A particularly important set of sources of information have been parish registers and key parish-based records like this one, Hingham Town Book from Norfolk, charts some really interesting accounts from church wardens, constables, overseers about the weather. In this case, I've just got a page here from 1681 that discusses a drought, which I've probably won't be able to read, but in that little red box there's a little note about a drought that began in the middle of March and lasted to early July in 1681. So these kinds of records are all important for the kind of work that we were seeking to do. We've also been using different types of records. I think the lighthouse record here, this is from the Great Orme, and is a logbook from the Great Orme. And it includes the lowest pressure reading on the 8th of December 1886, which coincides with a big storm event that's actually included in Lamb's compilation of storm events. But these kinds of records have also been key. And then among, I suppose, my favourite types of documents have been images like this from local studies archives. In this case, this is from Nottingham, where I used to be based. And these kinds of images, I think, some of them a bit staged, but nonetheless, they sort of provide really interesting and illustrative supporting information for some of the other rich materials that we've collected as part of the project. So we've got a freak hailstorm in the top left-hand corner, just like the one we've just had about half an hour ago here in Liverpool, actually, from May 1967, floods 1965, and then a wonderful image of a gentleman going skiing in the snow of 1969 with his block of flats behind him. A new strand of work has also involved us looking at school logbooks. And this is work that's being taken forward by some of my colleagues. In this case, this is a Welsh school logbook, and there's some wonderful types of anecdotes that you might be able to pull from these kinds of sources. In this case, from this piece from the West Glamorgan archives, we know on June 17th, 1887, it was excessively hot. The children are really struggling here. A great many little ones too hot and tired to keep awake in the afternoons. And you can just imagine the little heads sort of nodding away as they fall asleep on their desks. But this is a really rich source of information, these kinds of logbooks, and there's many of them about. So there's Simon Naylor and Neil MacDonald, James Bowen are developing this strand of work actually, but for Scotland. So one of our other case study areas was Northwest Scotland because of its propensity to storminess, and there's a whole series of logs, particularly around the Hebrides, logbooks like this, as a result of the 1872 Education Act, when the state took full responsibility for education, and the Act allowed for the establishment of school boards in every Scottish parish. And attendance at school was made compulsory, and schools were required to keep logbooks like this. And so there's very rich sources of information in the logs about weather and school attendance. So somewhat unusual source of information. Not the most unusual source of information, because we've also found references to weather in things like pigeon fancier records and a whole range of different arenas. So it's really quite good fun. Now, what we've done with everything that we've collected, and we've got about 20,000 different pieces of information in many different genres, many different forms, collected from all different archives and repositories, museums, and university collections. We've made it all available in a searchable user interface or a database publicly accessible, open access, which is out there. There's a link there to the version that's available through Nottingham. I've made a version available through Liverpool as well, and can share that link if it would be useful. But this is a database we call the Tempest, tracking extremes of meteorological phenomena experienced in space and time. And yeah, I think that, you know, the funding body will be happy with the title. I think it's worth its money. So Tempest is available to everybody, and it allows you, because we've been using, you know, we've been focusing on georeferenced material that we could place, material that we could date. It allows you to search by place and time, date. It allows you to search by type of weather event. So we've got a whole series of classifications of weather event. Responses, impacts, there's an open search function as well. And also directly by different alphabetical lists of places. So this is out there. And available for everybody to use. So in the interest of open access, it's something that people might want to explore. We've also produced a set of educational resources and have held a couple of exhibitions now on the work that we've been doing. Now, just in terms of Tempest and this database and its potential, and I'll come on to the way in which it can be used shortly. As I say, it's publicly available, searchable by a whole range of different things. And I did forget to mention that it's searchable by author, document type, variety of impact and response, as well as keywords. But it illustrates the richness, I think, of the UK documentary weather archive, broadly understood, because we're piecing together material that's been held in very disparate, different archives, never been brought together before. It allows you to see things a little differently and to see stories of weather in a different way. And it allows compilations of excerpts that have never been put together before. So this is allowing us to build an anatomy of particular events as they unfold in different parts of the country. We can explore the relationship between people and weather through time by looking over time or particular intervals. They show, because of the fact that we're looking at very different types of sources, that the changing nature of weather recording through history, and things like the local impacts of known events. So even though we didn't go in searching for known events, obviously those events that are already quite well known in people's memories or in records, whether they're instrumental or pre-instrumental, they've allowed us to explore the spatially varied implications of those events. And we're also able to capture particular events at the local level that are not always in national chronologies, so haven't been picked up before. So there's vast potential. Very quickly, before I get to some examples, just to illustrate its use. This is a staged example, so I've just done a bit of a screenshot of how you can use Tempest, really, just to give you an idea of how it works. And for this one, I have used an interval of time where I know there's a particular event that's taken place, just to try to illustrate how the database can be used. So I did a search for all wind events between 1st of February 1714, 28th of February 1715. And this pulled up a list of, as you can see here, a set of documents. The links are highlighted in green. You can click on those links and get the details about the document, the author, the quote, the details, information about impacts, responses. You can also display this in the form of a map, and you can click on one of these icons and it will take you to the document, the place, the impact, the description, etc. And you can see that this particular search yielded a lot of information about wind events in this kind of central England area. And if we were to click on one of those icons or any part of the list that I showed on the previous slide, you can start to get an idea of the kinds of quotes that we've got in the database. So actually, this search, and I knew this would happen because I know the data, this search revealed what's referred to as a hurricane, but a very severe, violent tempest of wind that was never known in any man's memory. That's quite a common phrase in the archive and in Tempest. And you can see the kind of scale of impact. So we've got references from Nottingham, from Yorkshire, from Lincolnshire, from Derbyshire, and from Norfolk. Different types of references, different types of author here. included in different types of material. So it allows you to see the way in which this event played out in across this sort of central area of the country. Okay, well, what I want to do with the final part then, and the rest of this talk, is to just think about some examples, some stories from the archives, and the way in which you can sort of use Tempest to reveal these kinds of themes. So looking at local events, pre-instrumental, adding texture to known events, exploring the spatial implication of nationwide events, so events that have taken place across the country, but looking at the way in which they played out differently in different parts of the country. Looking at relatively recent extremes, things that are probably within living memory, but then providing a historical context. And then thinking about, this is a new area of work really, thinking about the way in which people talked about future weather, weather forecasting, weather prediction, what was likely to happen in the archives. So I'm just going to proceed with the first one. Okay, I love this. This is, and I am a bit fixated on weather archives, so apology for somewhat over enthusiastic presentation. But on this one, this is a handbill that was included in a baptism register in Kirkayton in Derbyshire, and is a handbill documenting a tornado or whirlwind, the most tremendous tornado or whirlwind which affected Derbyshire, 12th of May, 1811. It was recorded in various different ways, and it appears in the Derby Mercury as well, not surprisingly, but this was the handbill that we found sort of stuck in to the Parish archive. And there's a very, very detailed description. I don't expect everybody to read this at all, but is an interesting account that allows us, for anybody who's interested in storm chasing, allows us to see the passage of the tornado or the whirlwind as it made its way through the districts of Kirkayton, Bonsall, Darley, Callow, Wirksworth, and sort of tearing a reek of havoc in its way. So really sort of causing a lot of damage, quite a lot of detail in terms of the scene that people saw, those who beheld it. And it provides this wonderful kind of sort of atmosphere as well. So this is the kind of quote that we can draw on to illustrate key point sources, key events that have happened locally that may not be picked up in other sources. So a really interesting reference there from that's in our collections, that's from Derbyshire. In the second kind of example, I just want to illustrate this point that I made about adding texture to known events. And in this case, the winter of 1739, 1740. And this might be one that some of you are well aware of. So this is the second coldest British winter of all time. Began in late December when temperatures dropped to -9 degrees and were made pretty vicious by biting winds. The following January was one of the coldest months on record as well. And it's in the Central England temperature series as being that. So this winter is something that's recorded as part of what's called a hemerologium, or a notebook, a book of remarks. In this case, James Harrison's notebook or book of remarks, again held in Derbyshire, this one. And this notebook was recorded as a kind of commentary on life, on world events, politics between 1734 1747. We think James Harrison was a shopkeeper in Belper. There's lots of references to sort of trade, politics. This is somebody who read the newspapers. This is somebody who was very au fait with global politics. But he details a lot about the winter and its spatial implications. So quotes like this: the Trent, River Trent was so hard that a wagon and 8 horses and 9 quarters of malt went over. And then, it should be a comma there, sorry, at London, about 15 persons were starved to death and drowned with cold. King George gave £1,000 to the poor in London, and this was in the London News, £4,000 to the Westminster poor. A little bit of information there in terms of differential relief. The frost increased so that about 20 of us played football on the Derwent. Numbers, you find a little bit of information about what's going on in Europe, because this was obviously a cold winter that affected much of Northwest Europe as well. So we get references to Amsterdam, Ireland, other places, starvation. And then some very specific quotes linked to the fact that it was difficult to cut bread because it was frozen hard, and boiling punch freezing in a matter of minutes. So some wonderful, rich quotes. But also in our collections from different sources were images like this one. So this is an engraving, artist unknown, but from Shrewsbury in the Great Frost, as it was called, 1739, 1740. And this shows the frozen River Severn. And this was the site for a story of a daredevil acrobat or rope artist called Robert Cadman. There's a plaque to Robert Cadman in Shrewsbury, because he fell to his death on the frozen River Severn during this year. He was a rope artist that was entertaining people who were having effectively a frost fair on the frozen river. But in this case, his rope act went wrong and he plunged to his death. And so we get interesting sort of anecdotes and somewhat gruesome stories from the archives as well. This is another example of where we can use our archival collections to add texture to already known events. Some of you may be familiar with the so-called Big Wind of January 1839. This is quite a well-known event. Became known as the Night of the Big Wind in some parts of the country, particularly affected Northern Ireland, the Northwest, Liverpool, where I am here. It was known as the Liverpool Hurricane. It was responsible for hundreds of shipwrecks, roofs being lost, chimneys collapsing, and the documents demonstrate the value, I think, in our Tempest database, demonstrates the value of collating narrative sources on the same weather event and seeing sort of multiple narratives on this to try to establish the geographical context and extent of the impacts, the path of the storm, and in this case, the local impacts of what we might think about as a sort of regional stroke national scale weather event. So it was recorded in Liverpool that 115 people died. There was flooding in some parts of the region. Damage to shipping in the Liverpool area caused Lloyd's insurance company considerable concern. Losses were estimated at nearly £500,000. There was evidence of tree loss in some parts of North and Central Wales. The Nautical Magazine and Naval Chronicle highlights Liverpool as an area that was really specifically damaged. And there were reports of remarkable features of the storm, being a degree of electricity as evidenced by lightning. We also get paintings. So this is an image that's in Liverpool Library's Liverpool Record Office of the Victoria steam tug and the magazine lifeboat rescuing passengers from the St Andrew packet ship just off the Liverpool coastline during the hurricane or big wind, actually on January the 8th, 1839, and this is by Samuel Walters. And other reports. In the top left here, we've got it's actually a poem and written by William Stanley Roscoe called The Storm, which was inspired by the big wind, and other references that are included in documents and published pamphlets and sort of souvenir pamphlets. So these are some of the quotes that we've gathered from different archival sources, from different collections to piece together the nature of the event. And these are written after the event, people reflecting on it, as well as immediately following the event, the days after it. So we've got references from a land agent in Cardiganshire, concerned about the damage to trees at the top there. The diary of William Parsons, 1839. He was a solicitor in Nottingham. As I remember from his diaries, some very rich, very entertaining diaries, because he enjoyed his alcohol, got into a number of scrapes, which he details in quite a lot of detail in his diaries, but he also records the big wind in Buildworth in Nottingham, and his own house and his father's house were damaged. Elizabeth Nutt Harwood, a female diarist, also notes the effects on her immediate estate. There's The Storm by William Stanley Roscoe, the first few lines of the poem, and then retrospectively a book of diaries made by Joseph Jenkins, and this is in the National Library of Wales. we also get references. So you can see the way in which this event is reported in different ways by different people in different parts of the country. We wouldn't be able to do that without having pieced it together in that kind of sense through Tempest. Other records chart the impacts in Herefordshire. We get references in Edward Lowe's notebook, the most terrible gale of modern times, in Shropshire, and again in weather logs, just sort of standard weather logs where people are keeping regular daily records of daily conditions. So some wonderful rich material that we can point to that illustrate the damage, but also the way in which people reported it, really. Okay. The third example focuses on the local aspects of nationwide events. And again, this might be an event that is familiar to some of you, 1826 drought. Now this was a prolonged drought. It affected large parts of the UK, followed a very cold January and February. There was a very dry and warm summer. In fact, the second warmest summer recorded, and heat and drought severely affected agriculture across the country. So we get different people again recording the event in different kinds of ways. So we've got Robert Phillips Shilton in Nottingham recording very high temperatures here through the second half of June in his diary. We've got a legal document from Bolingbroke in Lincolnshire referring to the decision to allow people to put their cattle, graze their cattle on the highways because fodder was in short supply and the grazing was poor until such date as rain arrives. So we know that cattle were short of water and they were short of food. A letter 4 weeks later implies that the water scarcity lasted even longer. And a letter from Batewood Ashwood in September refers to his decision to delay selling his land in Lincolnshire, as the county had suffered more than any other from the continued want of rain. And he didn't want anyone to view the land for sale at this particular point in time because it was looking so poor. So these are kind of very different types of description of the same event in different parts of the country again. I love this this letter from Harrogate, which was about concerns over the turnip crop. Turnips repeatedly make an appearance through Tempest, and there's a whole other project that we could do on turnips alone. They're very versatile. You can get 3 crops a year, so they're a really important form of sustenance for people and also an important source of fodder. But this event gets benchmarked, and I think this is also something that's really interesting that we can pick up from the work that we've done. We've got later accounts which recall the drought, the 1826 drought, like this extract from a manuscript history of the town of Fullerby in Lincolnshire, compiled by Henry Wynne in the 91st year of his life. Quote, with the purpose of placing it in the church parish chest for the use of posterity. And this was done in this was in 1906-07. But 1826 was the driest summer he could remember at the age of 11. And the country was parched in appearance, he says. The wells were dry. He describes how water from Lincoln was imported to Boston, where it sold for 3d a bucketful. Prompted by the conditions of 1826, experiments, ultimately unsuccessful though, for boring for water were undertaken at Boston and Lincolnshire. We get other references as well, like this one from the Wakefield family's memorandum in Shelford in Nottingham, which is written in a commonplace book of records, but they note the day of particular note within the drought period, an extreme within extreme, on the 18th of July, where many people dropped and died in the hot sun, so heat exhaustion. Parish registers, like this one from Droitwich St. Peter, compiled by the Reverend Lee, who frequently entered weather information into his register, refers back to 1826 in the entry for 1864, which also introduces a judgment, I think, on the relative extremity of the 2 dry years, so 1826 and 1864. The final archive is from the diary of William Holman in Norwich, who records that the 10th of March 1929 was the hottest March day since 1826, a fact that he had obtained from listening to a radio broadcast, and indicative of the way in which 1826 drought event entered the national memory. So one of the things that we're interested in is the way in which some events get remembered, some events get forgotten. But this is a form of memorialization, comparative memorialization. Coming into the final couple of examples now. I mentioned that those kinds of events that are within living memory, are still very much in the forefront of people's minds, but do have a kind of historical context to them as well. Many of you will be aware of this, the Lynmouth floods, the devastating Lynmouth floods in Devon in August 1952. And this occurred on the night of 15th to 16th of August, principally affecting the village of Lynmouth in North Devon. There was a storm with heavy rainfall combined with already saturated soil and flood debris led to a flooding of this village. Total loss, tragic loss of 34 lives. Now, you're probably aware there's all kinds of conspiracy theories around this particular flood event, which have emerged to explain the disaster, including one linked to geoengineering and rainmaking activity by the RAF, the practices which had emerged during the war and post-war using silver iodide cloud seeding techniques. And squadron leader Len Otley, who was working on this, there was a sort of Operation Cumulus nearby, has told the BBC that they jokingly referred to the rainmaking exercise as Operation Witch Doctor. But many of the people who have sort of investigated this particular event have assumed that the floods were part and parcel of this kind of rainmaking exercise that had been going on. It's unproven, there's lots of controversy over it, but what we do know, and again, serendipitous research in the archive has revealed that this place has been affected by major extreme floods before. Whether that's this cast doubt on the conspiracy theories or not, I don't know. I'll leave you up to make up your own minds on this one. But this is an interesting document from 8th of August 1770, again August, but nearly 200 years earlier. And it's actually a petition from a chap called John Short, but on behalf of the local community, for alleviation and relief for the local fishermen following what appears to have been a very similar scale and devastating flood and storm event. And there's around 30 signatures attached to this document, but it details the scale of the destruction of a major flood event in exactly the same place. And this community is seeking relief from and help and support because their livelihoods have been severely damaged. So you can see the nature of the quote here. I won't go through it all, but you can see the scale of devastation and the beseeching in this petition. Okay, right. Final example now, and then I'll draw this to a close. I mentioned earlier that one of the other themes that we're starting to look at, and I think is a really interesting one in the materials that we've been pulling out, focuses on future weather, really, the way in which people describe or try to understand future weather and try to anticipate future weather in the archive. And historical prognostication is obviously a really important area of inquiry, particularly through the 18th century, as Jankovic has already discussed in his work. And so this is, you'd be aware of this, this is the Shepherd of Banbury's rules. This is a very well-known treatise, if you like, or a record of prognostication. It discusses natural phenomena, weather law. Now this is his name was, it's a Shepherd of Banbury, also known as John Claridge, and this was published in 1748. It contains many different proverbs, weather law, sayings on different themes and topics, including clouds, animals, plants, seasons, human constitution, vegetables, stones and rocks, and how to use these as sources for prognostication. We know about this one, but there's also quite a lot of different examples of similar kinds of prognostication in different parts of the country. And this is just one of them. This is in Tempest, and this is a document produced by the parson of Pleasley, again in Derbyshire. Now, Pleasley is a one-time market town, then a cotton town, and later a coal town in Derbyshire. And the author, though not named in the document itself, is thought to have been a William Barker. Born in Edensaw, he went to Chesterfield Grammar School, then St John's, Cambridge, and received a BA, 1734, MA, 1735, and he became the parson at Pleasley before being registered to become Dean of Raphoe in Ireland. Now, the document, which is entitled Characteristics of the Weather by the Parson of Pleasley in Derbyshire, is intended as a reference text compiled on the basis of his own experiences and observations of the weather over the course of a year, and specifically its relationship to phases of the moon, phases of the sun, and also wind direction and other aspects of the weather. So he talks like this is just a selected couple of examples really, but if there appears a circle about the moon, you may expect stormy weather to follow shortly after the moon change on Sunday. It's almost certain a sign of flood before the next new moon. And there's other examples here. If there be no dew in a still summer's morning, you may expect rain before night, sometimes before noon. And these are all based on his own experiences. And this is an important point, because many of these experiences were proven to be inaccurate and incorrect. But given the way that we approached the study of our archival research, we've got evidence to suggest that is the case. And our open process, again, allowed a kind of serendipitous discovery of letters that cite this prognostication source, including one from 18th of January 1778, written by Francis Ferrand at Rufford to his father, who notes, "To our great joy, the frost broke up, notwithstanding the Pleasley prophets' promise of 3 weeks more bad weather." And they went on to have a very successful hunting trip, as it happens. So that's a document that's held in the Nottinghamshire Archives. Nonetheless, you get that kind of cross-referral through the approach that we've adopted. So to indicate that, in this case, the Parson of Pleasley's predictions were wrong. In the same sort of way, thinking about future weather, this is something you may have seen, George Merriweather's Tempest Prognosticator, and this is my final example. George Merriweather he was curator of Whitby Museum, and he was interested in developing a forecasting method for storms, really, otherwise known as the atmospheric electromagnetic telegraph conducted by animal instinct. This is the Tempest Prognosticator, and it consisted of 12 pint glass bottles, each containing a live leech, set around a circular stand under a bell, which was surmounted with surrounded rather by 12 little hammers. Each hammer was attached by a wire to a piece of whalebone set loosely in the neck of the top of this machine here, as you can see. And changes in atmospheric pressure before a storm would drive the leeches to the neck of the bottle, where they dislodged the pieces of whalebone and rang the bell at the top of the device. So as a storm was passing, as the pressure changed, there would be a whole load of bells ringing. So this was the Tempest Prognosticator, the way in which we could use leeches to predict, give us an idea of what the weather was likely to do, or the storm was on its way. Now, he did develop this to be sold at the Great Exhibition in 1851, in the hope that insurers might be interested in purchasing the patent. Not a one was sold, but there is a reconstruction of the Tempest Prognosticator in the Whitby Museum now. But what is interesting is that this was in the 1850s, but we've got a document from 100 years earlier where somebody else, actually in Great Yarmouth, a one William Burton, in writing to a friend, seems to describe something very similar. He notes in his letter, "I've been trying a new prognosticator of weather for some months past. Put a common horse leech, such as the apothecaries keep for drawing of blood, into a 12-ounce phial filled 2/3 full of water. Tie a piece of linen over the mouth of the phial, set it in your window and observe it every morning. If it, the leech, lies still in a lump at the bottom of the phial, the weather will be fair today. If it gets above the water, rain will soon follow. If it wriggles and frisks about, it denotes stormy weather." It is said oftentimes to cancel the barometer eye, it's better than the barometer, but a man should have several of them, several leeches in bottles, and take this prognostic from the majority. For one may happen to be sick, such as the case, I believe, with mine after a few months' confinement. So basically, his leeches on the windowsill were suffering a little bit, but nonetheless, we've got George Merriweather, but 100 years earlier, thanks to the approach that we've adopted, we've got other references to indicate the testing out of this methodology. So just to wrap up, what's the point of all of this? And of course, the there's a great deal of subjectivity in everything that we're looking at with all of these archives. You know, they are subjective documents, there's biases associated with them, they're not providing objective views on what the weather did. But it's differential perceptions, different definitions, different kinds of approaches to understanding and articulating weather in the past is what I'm interested in and what the team have been interested in. But there are some instances where we can use the sources that we've been looking at to extend the instrumental record, to provide different examples of events that maybe haven't been included in chronologies thus far. And they do allow us to think about extremes and unusual events in our country, at least, that sort of extends beyond the instrumental period. They give us a really good handle in terms of spatial and temporal varied impacts and responses to weather events. They allow us to see things that hasn't, you know, the approach allows us to see things that haven't necessarily been reported before. We can drill down and think about the spatial and temporal contingency, the way in which where things happened influenced people's the level of impact and how people were able to or not respond. And we can explore the anatomy of events as they unfolded. There is some really interesting work that's emerging around sequential events. So the way in which we can look at particular periods of crisis, you know, for example, during the Napoleonic Wars, 1795 through to the early years of the 19th century, when we see some really interesting periods of repeat and compound unusual weather, which compounded other political tensions, difficulties, rationing, difficulties securing food, and the implications, you know, the weather sort of aggravating ongoing tensions and difficulties and livelihoods. And we can also use the approach that we've adopted to look at different sort of methods of recording weather, understanding weather through time. And as I said earlier, this will allow us to sort of explore particular places and their resilience and vulnerability over time, particular communities maybe who are at risk in coastal areas, for example. But these stories are also useful in terms of risk communication. There's some really interesting work that's focusing on the way in which making things more local, more linked to personal experience in places is a valuable risk communication tool and method, particularly in a context of increasing extremes, high frequency, high intensity extremes, as we're seeing associated potentially with climate change. So using stories in place, stories that are about experience, also looking at the way in which people understood, articulated, reacted, can be a really useful risk communication story, a really useful risk communication tool as we go forward and thinking about climate futures. And that's exactly what we've been trying to do by developing a play called The Storm Officer, which we did with some follow-on funding, which uses inspiration from the archives that we've been looking at. We had a playwright working with us to sort of use stories from the archives to develop a play, which we then had on a bit of a tour a couple of years ago, including at the Minack, which was the most wonderful day. And it's all about risk communication and thinking about the way in which we can use history to tell contemporary stories and link them to contemporary weather events. So I think that's probably where I should leave it today. I think that I've probably overrun on time, but I'm very happy to answer any questions and talk through any comments if there are any. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Georgina. That's a wonderful talk and very informative. We have a number of questions that have been coming in. I don't know if we can get through all of them, but I'm going to select a few and ask you to have a go at them. One of them, I might in fact try and merge one or two while in the process. So I asked a question about the fact that we have probably the most complete archives of weather anywhere, but what can your approach do for other parts of the world? And a particular question was asked about the US and Canada. Could that be studied in this way? Because the American Philosophical Society has holdings that they've been transcribing.
Yeah, definitely. So yes, on all fronts actually. So there's lots of very similar kinds of approaches that are adopted in different parts of the world. So I've personally also been involved in very similar kind of archival work in Central Southern Africa with my colleague David Nash over many years, and maybe that's the subject of another talk for the future, but we adopted a similar kind of approach using, in this case, missionary archives, missionary correspondence as one source of information alongside letters from others, trade records, sort of colonial, the blue books, the colonial records, newspaper archives. And in that case, we built up a chronology of drought and flood events through the Kalahari as an example, but also looked at stories of impacts and responses. We did the same kind of work with another group in Uganda recently, and I've spent many of my previous years, so when I first started out in academia, working in Mexico doing similar kind of work, but obviously using materials in Spanish from the Spanish colonial period, in my case from the 16th century up to the early part of the 19th century in independence. There's archives everywhere, and weather is ubiquitous, as I say. It's not just a UK thing. There's a very rich source of information and some wonderfully rich materials and research by colleagues, particularly people like Eleonora Rowland, Carrie Mock, looking at hurricane events in the US and Caribbean, Dorian Burnett, a whole range of people actually who use different kinds of archival sources in different contexts. So it's limitless, really. Wherever people have written stuff, they've invariably talked about the weather. So the potential is there to do some really rich weather work. So I think, we've just been talking, actually, myself and Dave Nash, about some work that we're trying to get underway in the Pacific, using some of the records there as an example, Pacific Islands, which would also be a very nice place to visit. So. But anyway, that's further work. So yeah, it's really not isolated to the UK, and there's rich opportunities everywhere.
Okay, thank you for that. Here's one from Nigel. Does there need to be more than one source for it to be called extreme?
Yeah. Okay, so I think one of the things that we were keen to do with this work was only really consider those events where we've got multiple references to those events. If it's isolated instances, it's very difficult to verify. So we've recorded them and we've kept them in the database. So you can go along and have a look at them, because we'd like to continue to add to the database as we do more work. But I think it's important for triangulation purposes to have 2, 3, 4 references to the same event from different kinds of perspectives to try to get some kind of assurance that the event was extreme or unusual. But one of the interesting things with this work is that we've been also trying to get a handle on, well, what constitutes extreme, what constitutes unusual, and there's very different perspectives on that, and that is interesting in its own right. But when we've got more than a group of people saying this was the most terrible storm in history, or this was the most devastating flood in 20 years, then if you've got more people saying that, then you can take some assurance that it probably was.
There's a follow-up question here from Martin Young. How accurate are people's memories when they compare a recent event with a previous one?
It's a really good question. Not very, actually. I think you get, I think there's a lot of people who are diarists, and we've used a lot of materials that are people who had an active interest in the weather, and they tend to be fairly accurate. Through the kind of oral history work that we've been doing on later and other projects, that memory is sometimes subject to the recency effect, as I say, or can be a bit misremembered. So we often have to think about that when we're looking at the kind of benchmarking and comparative material that I was showcasing with the 1826 drought, for example. We do have to sort of delve down and think whether people have got it right, if they're a couple of years out. It's a bit like that sort of tendency for people to have this sort of nostalgic sense that it was always snowier in the past, or we don't get summers like we used to, or so on. There is that kind of lens that people look through, and so it's about seeking verification from other sources. But as I say, for those sources of material that we've been using were they're created by people who had an interest in weather. So people who were recording weather because they had instruments or they had interest in weather law. They tend to be a little bit more accurate. It's a good question though, really good question.
Okay. Right. There's a couple of questions about the archive itself.
Yeah.
Do you, well, there's one particularly about the leeches, but there was another one.
I can send that on. I can send it on to you, Mike, and maybe you can circulate that. I'm just trying to see if I've got
it. But is it a straightforward matter of typing leech into the Tempest?
Yeah, no, no, it wasn't leech that we typed in. For that one, it was let me just check where it was. I can find it. Yes, so this one was in the Nottingham University Library, Department of Manuscripts and Special Collections. I've got the code here, is PIC 37/39. Okay, I can send that on if anybody wants it. But one of the that will have come up because we did a search around storm, I suspect, or just weather. It has references to stormy weather, but we didn't sort of find George Merriweather and then go, oh, we need to find something about leeches. This was a serendipitous find because we've been doing work chronologically through the collection in Nottingham.
So Grant is the questioner here. If you didn't catch that reference, you can send an email either to me or to, if you have Georgina's email, you can use hers, send it to her directly. If you haven't got either of ours, send a message to the society and it should get to us.
My email is georgina.endfield@liverpool.ac.uk should anybody want to get in touch.
Yeah,
I've also got a guidebook for Tempest for the database, which is out there. So if anybody wants a guidebook on how to use it and how to create stories from it, then please get in touch. I've got lots of copies.
Right, yeah, I quite like this one, sorry. Is there much evidence of records of damage due to extreme weather changing as a result of improved building maintenance? In other words, is our relationship, does the weather do less damage now than it used to?
Gosh, that's a really interesting question, and one that I don't know that I can answer that fully in terms of examples. What I think we do see is we see adaptations. Maybe not so much in buildings, but certainly in things like farm management and the way in which drainage ditches were effectively built to accommodate floodwaters and so on, or particular investments in floodwater management, particularly in some of the work in the fens, actually. In terms of building maintenance, that's an interesting one. I'm not sure I've got examples that I can bring to bear immediately, but I can do a search and we can have a look and see if we've got anything that we can support to address that one. There's a lot around adaptation. There's a lot around what people have done to make themselves more resilient, planting different things, different points in time, thinking about new forms of farm management, as I say, or new ways of land management, new sort of approaches to land management. So I'll have a look at that. It's a good one. Thank you.
Okay, this is sort of extending the database into the present day. How far does it extend into recent times?
We've got examples that take us up to the 2000s, and so and what we've, I suppose it's what we've got today, but which is also a good thing, but also a bit of a worry, is that we've got a lot of social media reporting. So in the way in which people used to write letters, note things down in a document, keep journal diaries and so on, everything's quite ephemeral these days. It's in digital format. I worry about the weather archive of the future as a result. So there is a huge amount of information available, but it's we've been interested mainly from the sort of recent things in sort of looking at the way in which people record things through blogs and so on. It's a different kind of recording. But I think that question is one that really sort of makes me think about the anxieties I have about our future weather archive as a result. But obviously we're in different times, and there's very advanced recordings and prognostication, if you wanted to call that, forecasting and so on. So maybe it's an unfounded worry, but we don't have the letters, the diaries, the journals, the anecdotes, the postcards anymore, because people just send text.
Thank you. I think probably, where are we? Yeah, perhaps if we try one more question, to see what we can find. I think we've just about dealt with that.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. One of the ways of testing climate prediction models is to evaluate how well they can simulate past weather. How useful do you think this anecdotal information is in creating a coherent picture of earlier climates?
Yeah, I mean, it is only anecdotal, and it is qualitative. So, I think there are challenges and limitations with what this material can do, right?
And it's focused on the extremes mostly.
Yeah, or unusual, things that weren't norms. So I don't think it's necessarily about using this to inform climate prediction so much as to use it as a means of engaging people with understanding risk through sort of localized, particular experiential based stories, and adding a kind of texture to our own weather heritage. I think it's an important aspect of the way in which we understand places, we understand people and culture. Arguably, potentially, we have a particular way of thinking about the weather in the UK. But so I think it's more about that than it is about providing evidence to support, climate modelling per se, and thinking about future climates in that context. It's about communication and sharing stories, really.
Okay, just a short one to finish. Do you happen to know the ages of the diarists, the youngest and the oldest?
I haven't looked at that. We do have people who are sent, in the hundreds. We do definitely, but I don't know the youngest. So I'm going to look for that now. I'm going to I'll have a look, and I'll feed that back. But it's a really interesting question. The demographic is it's an interesting one. I thought, it tends to be a bit of a gendered thing, weather recording. But what we've got is a lot of in terms of demography. I'm not talking about age, but talking about sort of who produced the materials. We've got a lot more women letter writers and a lot more male weather recorders. So I don't know whether that tells us much, but in terms of ageism, if you wanted to call it that, that's something I can look at for sure. I hadn't thought of that one.
Right, I think we should wind it up there. Thank you very much, Georgina. That's been very, very interesting. Thank you to everybody for attending and for all your questions. I've just got a couple of wrap-up slides here at the end. First of all, the talks, all our talks are available as videos after the event. Probably it takes about a week to get up there. So you just go to the events page, which is where you went to log into this thing in the first place, and you click the video and you can hear the whole talk again. Second one is I'm trying to build up a membership list for the East Midlands Local Centre. So at the moment, the membership consists of the committee, which is a bit limiting. What the membership list will do is allow me to keep people up to date with future events and so on separately from the mailing and publicity put out by the Royal Meteorological Society. So if you'd like to be part of that, just email eastmidlands@rmets.org, and that will eventually come to be in the form of a list, and I will be able to email you accordingly. Thank you very much again, Georgina, for giving us a wonderful talk, very informative, very full of fascinating information. And I hope everybody else has enjoyed it as much as I have. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for having me. Great questions. So thank you very much. Food for thought.